The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The arrogant billionaire smirked, refusing to stand as the black judge entered. He believed his wealth placed him above respect, above the law. But just moments later, the very woman he mocked would leave him speechless, delivering a verdict that no amount of money could overturn. What happened next changed everything. The grand courtroom gleamed under the polished chandeliers, its high marble walls echoing with whispers and muffled conversations. Lawyers adjusted their ties, journalists scribbled in their notepads, and a row of jury members sat rigid, waiting. The air carried an unspoken tension, the kind that only appeared when a man like Richard Langford was on trial. Richard, a self-made billionaire in his late 50s, sat comfortably in his seat, exuding the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. His tailored suit, crisp and immaculate, hugged his broad frame as he tapped his fingers idly against the wooden desk before him. He didn't belong here, at least not in his mind. This was a waste of his time. He had beaten worse charges before. Across the room, Judge Maya Carter entered, her black robes flowing like liquid authority. The moment she stepped forward, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Carter." Everyone stood. Everyone except Richard Langford. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a rising tide. Some exchanged glances, while others simply watched, frozen. Richard smirked, leaning back in his chair, making no effort to move. "I don't stand for people who haven't earned it," he muttered, just loud enough for those around him to hear. The bailiff hesitated, eyes flickering toward Judge Carter. The stenographer briefly stopped typing. Even the opposing attorneys shifted in discomfort. But Judge Carter? She didn't flinch. She paused at the bench, her dark brown eyes locking onto Richard. The weight of her presence pressed against the arrogance that oozed from him, yet she offered no immediate reaction. Instead, she adjusted her gavel on the desk, smoothed the pages before her, and finally spoke in a voice so steady, so unshaken, that it commanded the room without a single ounce of force. "Mr. Langford," she said, her tone neutral, controlled, "I see you've chosen to make a statement today." Richard chuckled under his breath. "Just saving my energy, Your Honor. I have places to be." His lawyers shifted uncomfortably beside him. Even they knew that defying a federal judge, especially this one, was a mistake. But Richard had built an empire on defiance. He had outmaneuvered regulators, bought off politicians, and crushed competitors without mercy. A single judge? A black judge? She was just another obstacle. Foreshadowing seeped into the room like a slow, creeping storm. A court officer standing near the back exchanged a quick glance with the prosecutor, David Green. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was something in Judge Carter's expression that unsettled them. This wasn't anger. This was calculation. Then, in a single unremarkable movement, she reached for a file. A thin, unassuming folder, different from the stacks of documents already prepared for the trial. No one noticed the way her fingers drummed against the cover, except for one person, the stenographer, who stopped typing just long enough to blink at the oddity. Something was coming. Something none of them expected. And Richard Langford, seated so comfortably in his defiance, was about to realize that the seat he refused to leave might just become his undoing. A sharp silence filled the courtroom, thick with the weight of Richard Langford's defiance. His refusal to stand was more than just arrogance. It was a challenge, a silent declaration that in his world, power was bought, not earned. Respect was optional, reserved only for those he deemed worthy. And in his mind, Judge Maya Carter was not one of them. Judge Carter, however, didn't react the way he expected. No flash of anger, no demand for an apology. Instead, she simply flipped open the thin folder she had set aside earlier, her fingers gliding over the pages as if she had all the time in the world. "Mr. Langford," she said, her voice unwavering, "since you're so determined to remain seated, I assume you're confident in your position today." Richard smirked, leaning back in his chair. "That would be correct, Your Honor. I'm sure we can all agree that this trial is a complete waste of time." The murmur of the courtroom grew louder, a ripple of unease spreading through the crowd. The audacity, the sheer boldness of the statement. Even his own attorneys looked uneasy, one of them subtly nudging Richard under the table in warning. But the billionaire was unfazed. Judge Carter glanced at the prosecution's table, where David Green, the lead federal prosecutor, sat with his team. He was watching closely, his eyes flickering between her and Richard, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. "A waste of time," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. Then, she turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've been called here today because the federal government has accused Mr. Langford of orchestrating the largest financial fraud scheme in the past decade. Billions of dollars vanished, retirements wiped out, families destroyed. And yet," she paused, turning her gaze back to Richard, "he finds it all to be a waste of time." A few jurors stiffened in their seats. Richard chuckled under his breath, unbothered. "Objection," his lead attorney finally spoke, voice tight with frustration. "Your Honor, my client is entitled to his opinion, and I hardly think his personal feelings about this case are relevant." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow, an amused but unreadable expression crossing her face. "His personal feelings?" she echoed. She tapped a neatly manicured nail against the wooden bench before her. "Mr. Langford, let's test that theory. Since you believe this is a waste of time, I assume you have no problem speeding things up." Richard shrugged. "The sooner this ends, the better." The entire room shifted, the energy turning sharper, colder. Judge Carter reached into the folder again and pulled out a small USB drive. A simple device, unremarkable in every way, except for the way the lead prosecutor suddenly straightened in his seat. Richard's smirk faltered. "Your Honor," his lawyer interjected quickly, "we were not informed of any additional evidence." "Oh, this isn't additional," Carter interrupted smoothly. "This is the foundation. And since Mr. Langford is so eager to move things along, I think it's only fair we go ahead and play it for the court. Don't you agree?" She turned to the bailiff. "Play the file labeled Exhibit C on the main screen." The lights dimmed slightly as the large courtroom monitor flickered to life. Static for a brief moment. Then, video footage. A grainy security recording, the timestamp marking it from nearly 6 months ago. A private boardroom, a meeting in progress. And there, at the head of the table, was Richard Langford himself. His voice was unmistakable, cutting through the static like a blade. "They won't know what hit them. By the time the market reacts, we'll have already cashed out." A gasp erupted from somewhere in the gallery. One of Richard's attorneys visibly paled. "Your Honor." The defense shot up. "This evidence, this wasn't submitted." "Incorrect," Judge Carter interjected, her voice cool. "This evidence was submitted under seal. The prosecution was granted permission to reveal it at the appropriate time. That time is now." Richard's jaw clenched. The smirk, gone. The confidence, cracking. Judge Carter folded her hands in front of her, watching as realization dawned on the man who had been so certain of his untouchable status. "Mr. Langford," she said, her voice carrying through the now silent courtroom, "still think this is a waste of time?" A suffocating silence settled over the courtroom. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector as the damning video continued to play, each second dragging Richard Langford deeper into the quicksand of his own arrogance. His fingers curled into fists against the polished mahogany table, but his face, once full of smug confidence, was beginning to betray the first flickers of something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Across the room, Judge Maya Carter watched him carefully. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat. Instead, she sat composed, her sharp eyes absorbing every micro-expression, every desperate flicker in his gaze as his carefully crafted world began to crack. "Your Honor," his lead attorney stammered, his voice louder now, as if volume alone could drown out the truth. "This footage is highly prejudicial. It was taken out of context." "Out of context?" Judge Carter interrupted, her tone impossibly calm. "Mr. Langford, would you like to provide some context? Perhaps explain to the jury exactly what you meant when you said, 'By the time the market reacts, we'll have already cashed out.'" Richard exhaled sharply through his nose, leaning back in his chair with a defiance that felt more like desperation. "I don't have to explain anything." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. His legal team looked like they wanted to physically drag him out of his chair. His arrogance, once his greatest asset, was now a noose tightening around his neck. The jury members exchanged glances, some of them leaning in, suddenly more engaged. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. He had lost them. Judge Carter let the moment stretch, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then, with deliberate precision, she turned to the prosecution. "Mr. Green," she addressed the lead prosecutor, "does the government have any additional evidence that might contextualize Mr. Langford's words?" David Green, who had been waiting for this exact moment, smiled. "We do, Your Honor," he replied smoothly. The prosecution submits Exhibit D, financial records confirming that within 48 hours of that boardroom meeting, Mr. Langford's hedge fund executed sell orders totaling over $1.2 billion. A collective inhale filled the room. Even Richard's most loyal supporters, the ones who had clung to the illusion of his innocence, looked visibly shaken. Richard, for the first time, shifted in his seat. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Every executive moves money around. That's not a crime." Judge Carter tilted her head slightly. "Mr. Langford, are you claiming these transactions were purely coincidental?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I don't owe you an explanation." Her fingers tapped against the bench, slow and deliberate. "Mr. Langford," she continued, "I have a question for you, and I strongly advise that you think carefully before answering." He exhaled sharply, clearly irritated. "What?" She leaned forward just slightly. "Are you familiar with perjury laws?" A dangerous pause. His lawyers looked ready to combust. One of them grabbed his arm, whispering furiously into his ear. But Richard had spent a lifetime dominating rooms like this. He had never once backed down. "I know my rights," he shot back, "and I'm done answering your stupid questions." Judge Carter sighed, shaking her head slightly. He had just made his biggest mistake. "Very well," she said, nodding to the bailiff. "Strike the witness's last response from the record." And then she picked up a different folder, one that hadn't been touched yet, one that even the prosecution hadn't seen. "Since Mr. Langford is unwilling to answer questions," she announced, flipping through the pages, "I suppose we'll just have to rely on the facts." She turned to the clerk. "Please display Exhibit E." The screen flickered again, but this time it wasn't surveillance footage. It was emails, a long, damning chain of correspondences, each one implicating Richard Langford in a premeditated, deliberate scheme to manipulate financial markets. His own words, immortalized in black and white. Make sure we're ahead of the drop. Get the sell orders ready. We'll be out before anyone even notices. By the time they figure it out, they'll be broke. Not our problem. Richard's face drained of color. His lawyers, now fully aware that their client was sinking fast, erupted in a flurry of objections. But it didn't matter. Because the jury was watching. Because the courtroom was silent. Because Judge Carter hadn't even played her final card yet. "Mr. Langford," she said finally, closing the folder with a crisp snap, "you've made it very clear that you don't believe you need to stand for this court. But you may want to reconsider that stance." A tense pause. "Because when I pass my ruling, I guarantee—" She let the words linger, her voice calm and deadly. "You won't have a choice." The courtroom was frozen in time. The damning evidence hung in the air like a guillotine poised to drop. Richard Langford sat rigid in his chair, his once smug confidence shattered. His hands gripped the arms of his seat so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The weight of his own words, displayed in black and white on the courtroom monitor, pressed down on him with a force he had never experienced before. Judge Maya Carter remained composed, her expression unreadable, but the intensity in her eyes was undeniable. She had dealt with powerful men before, men who thought the law was nothing but an inconvenience, a game they could play and win with enough money. But not this time. A murmur spread through the gallery, growing into a wave of hushed disbelief. Even Richard's most devoted allies, the ones who had defended him for years, now wore expressions of doubt, of fear. They were watching a king fall from his throne, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Objection!" His lead attorney's voice cracked through the tense silence, desperation woven into every syllable. "This evidence was not properly disclosed. This is a clear case of ambush." Judge Carter didn't blink. Mr. Langford and his legal team were given every opportunity to disclose their financial records. They chose not to. The court obtained these documents through an independent federal investigation. She tapped the thick folder in front of her. "And as of this morning, the Department of Justice has officially filed an indictment on additional charges of securities fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." The air was sucked from the room. Richard snapped his head up at her words, his face now a shade paler than before. "That's impossible," he hissed. "You can't—" "I can." Judge Carter cut him off. "And I have." For the first time in the trial, Richard looked small. He turned to his lawyers, seeking reassurance, but they had none to offer. One of them avoided his gaze altogether, while another frantically flipped through their case files, looking for an escape route that no longer existed. And then, the final blow. Judge Carter leaned forward, her voice dropping just enough that every person in that courtroom had to lean in to hear her. "Mr. Langford," she said, her tone deadly calm, "you refuse to stand for this court. You refuse to acknowledge the authority of this bench. But let me be perfectly clear. This court does not need your acknowledgement to exercise its power." A tense pause. "However," she continued, her voice razor-sharp, "you will be standing now." She lifted her gavel. "Bailiff, take the defendant into custody." A gasp echoed through the room. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor, journalists scrambling to capture the moment, and a single shocked exhale from Richard himself. He barely had time to react before two uniformed officers moved swiftly toward him. "You can't do this," he spat, his voice laced with fury and panic. "I have rights. Do you know who I am?" The officers ignored his protests, gripping his arms firmly as they hauled him to his feet. The very act, the billionaire being forced to stand, despite his earlier refusal, was poetic in its own cruel justice. Judge Carter watched with stoic resolve as Richard Langford, the man who had built an empire on arrogance and corruption, was now reduced to a powerless defendant, being escorted out in handcuffs. As he was dragged toward the exit, his furious gaze met hers one last time. But she simply gave him a single unreadable look before speaking one final time. "Now you understand, Mr. Langford," she said, her voice cool and steady. "No one is above the law." The heavy courtroom doors slammed shut behind him. The courtroom remained still, as if the very walls were absorbing the gravity of what had just happened. The billionaire, once untouchable, once feared, was now nothing more than another disgraced man in handcuffs. The echoes of the heavy doors slamming behind Richard Langford still lingered, but no one dared to speak. Judge Maya Carter sat motionless on the bench, watching the stunned expressions of those before her. The jurors, who had entered this trial uncertain and wary, now sat in silent acknowledgement of the power of justice. The prosecution team, who had spent years building this case, exchanged subtle nods, their relief evident, but restrained. The defense attorneys, once so confident in their ability to bend the system, now avoided eye contact with anyone, their careers undoubtedly tarnished by their association with a man who had believed he was invincible. And then there was the audience. Investors who had lost everything, former employees whose futures had been shattered by Langford's greed, and journalists who had followed his rise and fall. Their expressions varied, some filled with quiet triumph, others simply processing what they had witnessed. But there was one undeniable truth painted across every face in that room. Justice had been served. Judge Carter took a breath, her composure never wavering. She tapped her gavel once more. "Court is adjourned." Slowly, people began to rise. The tension that had gripped the room loosened, but never fully disappeared. Whispers filled the space as journalists rushed to report the unprecedented downfall of Richard Langford. As Judge Carter stood to leave, a small voice called out, "Your Honor?" She turned. An older woman, dressed in simple yet elegant attire, stood near the back of the gallery. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a small folder of documents, old stock papers, now worthless, her entire savings, stolen by Langford's scheme. For a moment, she simply held Judge Carter's gaze. Then she nodded, a silent acknowledgement, a thank you that didn't need words. Judge Carter nodded back, and then, with quiet grace, she turned and walked away. Because her job was done. Justice had spoken. The air outside the courthouse was crisp, the city humming with the aftermath of what had just transpired. News cameras flashed, reporters scrambled to capture reactions, and the world watched as the once mighty Richard Langford was escorted into a waiting police van, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief. He had spent a lifetime bending the rules, buying his way out of consequences. But today, there was no escape. Judge Maya Carter stepped outside moments later, the cool breeze brushing against her face. She paused at the top of the courthouse steps, gazing at the sea of people gathered below. Some cheered, others simply stared, still processing the fact that justice had actually been served against a man who had once seemed untouchable. She didn't bask in the moment, didn't indulge in any sense of victory. This wasn't about winning. It was about doing what was right. And that, she knew, was the only thing that truly mattered. As she turned to leave, a journalist called out, "Judge Carter, any final words on today's ruling?" She stopped just briefly, glancing over her shoulder. Then, with the same quiet authority that had dismantled Richard Langford's arrogance, she simply said, No one is above the law. And with that, she walked away. But the question remains, do you believe justice was truly served today? Was Langford's downfall enough, or should there have been an even harsher punishment? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us that justice is still possible.